Hi, this is Jess, and I'm making this video about Jordan Peterson's conversation with Bishop Baron.
All right, so let me share some of my thoughts with you. It'll be kind of a lengthy introduction to our discussion.
The conversation was pretty good.
These guys aren't the best conversation partners to go back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the dialogue back and forth could be better.
Again, here, we're sort of sitting in a seminar. These are my thoughts. I want you to understand my thoughts, and I want you to compare them with what you know, and I want you to give me some feedback.
That's kind of what I'm going to try to do here. I'm going to try to engage and share some ideas as I go through this video, because there was something specifically that caught my attention, and it was the book of Job. Surprise, surprise. Peterson's been talking about the book of Job lately. It comes up in his interviews.
It's a terrible book.
Oh, yeah.
Partially because it's the subject of one of the chapters in his new book, but also I think it's just because he's trying to still puzzle it out.
Please correct me if you think I've got anything wrong here theologically.
The Bishop Baron interview starts out with Peterson talking about AI.
Using large language models to investigate the concept of God.
Then they go into talking about the Bible and Adam and Eve.
They can't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Bishop Baron starts talking about worship.
Paul Tillich said that. Just find out what people worship.
Which then Peterson goes into sort of the nature of sacrifice.
The rest of the Bible is an attempt to work out the definition of the highest form of sacrifice.
And that's when he starts talking about the book of Job about 30 minutes in. So I'm going to play a little bit of a longer clip here, and I'll interrupt it as I go.
The definition of the highest form of sacrifice. Now you see that being played with across a whole array of great stories. That's the stories of the prophets' lives, let's say, and the encoding of the lessons of their lives in the law. But then you have, okay, now that sort of culminates in some ways with the story of Job, right? Because Job and the pattern of sacrifice that's exemplified by Job.
Peterson says two things here that are really interesting. One, that the idea of sacrifice is developing and sort of culminates in the book of Job. And two, that there's something significant about the nature of sacrifice exemplified in Job. Now, I think he's sort of jumping the gun here on something. I think he is jumping the gun on making a Job-Christ connection, which I think is there and I agree with. And just like Christ is a sacrifice for our sins, Job is sort of a prefiguration of that in the way that he suffers. So I don't dispute that, but by kind of jumping the gun on that, we kind of miss something that is already in the text, because there's two explicit sacrifices that are done. One is at the end and one is at the beginning. So the one at the end is the sacrifice that Job's friends are told to make, because God is not happy with them, with how they treated Job and what they said. So God says, bring in this sacrifice, and my servant Job will pray for you, and then I'll forgive you. Now, the sacrifice at the beginning, which I want to emphasize here, is one that Job made on a continual basis. He made a sacrifice on behalf of his children in conjunction with a series of feasts that his children held. So each of his sons, his 7 sons, would hold a feast in their home, and then after this series of feasts, he would gather all of his children together, including his daughters, and offer a sacrifice on behalf of each one of them, just in case during this period of time sin may have cropped up in their heart. Now, why does this matter? Well, because Peterson's asking the question about sort of the nature of sacrifice. And not only that, but he's asking the question, what if we all brought the proper sacrifice? What's the highest and best sacrifice to bring? And one of the things that I think we're supposed to read into the book of Job is that Job, from the beginning, is a man who is bringing the proper sacrifices. So I just want to bring that up. Job is already bringing the proper sacrifices. And, well, I just need to make that point before we sort of continue on. So let's keep going.
Okay, so what happens to Job is that almost all the unjust suffering of the world is laid on his shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and what Job says, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what Job says, and Job is suffering so much and so unjustly that his wife comes to him and says, the only
curse
thing
God
left
and
for
God
you
die.
is to curse, shake your fist at God and die. Right.
Mrs.
And Job
Job,
says,
one of the great figures in the Bible.
Exactly.
Mrs.
exactly.
Okay, so
Well,
they start
and-
making jokes about Job's wife, which there are a million of them.
I mean, the devil took everything from Job. Killed his kids, killed his livestock. But his wife did not die.
Okay, so I do want to take this opportunity, though, to say a little bit about Job's wife, because I find this part just fascinating. So Job and his wife interact very, very briefly, and it's after the two disasters. So the first disaster is he loses his wealth and his children, and the second disaster is he's inflicted with that terrible skin disease. And then it's right immediately following that Job and his wife talk, and I'm just going to read that right now. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So the first thing to notice is that she is clearly pushing Job in the direction that Satan wants him to go, which is to curse God. And in this way, she's sort of this negative figure, a tempting figure. And there are these sort of Adam and Eve garden, tree of the knowledge of good and evil vibes happening here. Even in like the word choice, just like Eve took the fruit first, then offered it to Adam, there's a way in which Job's wife is offering this temptation to Job, which is to curse God. And you can even see this relationship in what Job says, which is, shall we receive good from God and shall we not receive evil? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's all being played with right here. Now, Job refuses, which is interesting because Adam eats the fruit and here Job refuses. So all that's going on. But I do want to look at what Job's wife says. There's two things that she says. She says three things, but there's two that are really interesting. So the first one is, do you still hold fast your integrity? Just a few verses before, God and Satan are in a conversation right before Job gets struck with his skin disease. And God says, well, I'll just read the interaction here between God and Satan. So this is after the first disaster has struck. Job's wealth is gone and his children are dead. And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life, but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." An important thing to remember is this conversation between Satan and God is happening in heaven. Like Job, his wife, anyone else are not privy to it. They don't hear it. But somehow Job's wife knows about two important facts that are talked about. One, which God mentions, is Job's integrity. Two, which is the wager that Satan makes that Job will curse God. Who knows how she knows this? This is the mystery of women. She intuits these things, and then even though she communicates it to Job in sort of a negative way, those two things are still communicated. The value of his integrity and also the nature of the wager. Because she communicates these things, and I don't think, Job isn't realizing this consciously, like, oh, there's a wager in heaven, or that God values my integrity. But these two things become vitally, vitally important for him, and which is to maintain his integrity in the face of all of the accusations of his friends, and then also to not curse God, which Peterson goes on to kind of like elaborate more on. These two things sort of are the guiding posts that enable Job to go through his suffering. And those are the two things that his wife says to him that are so important. And there's actually three. She says, curse God and die. So she brings death into the picture, which gives off Adam and Eve vibes too, because the curse of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was death. And so, yeah, there's all that. Anyway, let's keep going on with Peterson and Bishop Baron.
She's upset by what's happening to him and can't see a way out. Now, Job says,
no, but she's right. She's the voice of so many today who they resent God.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely.
Just curse God and die. I mean, who needs all this transcendent nonsense?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, or the whole bloody game, like that's Goethe's Mephistopheles. It's like suffering. Yeah. The world is so rife with suffering. It would be better if the whole game just ceased.
Right.
That'd be the antinatalists. Right. Well,
curse
it's a powerful argument. Curse God and die. Okay, but Job says, no, I refuse to do that, and I refuse to do it on principle. I'm going to assume. So this is a statement of faith. I am not going to abandon my faith in the essential goodness of being, regardless of the proximal evidence. And I'm not going to curse myself finally, because although I'm not a perfect man, I am a good man. And so I'm not going to say that everything that's happened to me, I deserve in some causal manner. And I'm certainly not going to say that the structure of being itself is corrupt.
Okay, so right there, he reiterates kind of those 2 points, that I'm not going to curse myself. I'm not a perfect man, but I am a good man and I don't deserve this. So Job's integrity. And then I'm not going to say that the structure of being is corrupt, which is curse God. That's Peterson speak for that.
Now, you can think about that practically. So imagine if you're in a situation like Job's where your world has fallen apart, and maybe even genuinely to some degree through no clear fault of your own, or no fault that couldn't be laid at the feet of good men in general. What's your best strategy? Well,
before Peterson gets into what's your best bet or your best strategy when you are suffering, I want to problematize the premise of Job a little bit more. One of the things that I think is important to remember is that Job suffers not despite being a good man, but because he is a good man. And Job has to not just believe in the goodness of being despite the appearances, but he has to come to terms with the fact that it is the goodness of being that has struck him with these tragedies. The speed and totality of the disasters that come upon Job leave no question in his mind that God has done this. If it was just one or two things, maybe it was an accident, maybe it was, some bad guys, someone else, maybe it was just bad luck. But because of its totality, because it happened all at once, and it was everything, like there's no question, it's God that did it. And so Job knows his own integrity. He knows he's a good man. And he also knows God to be good. It's been his experience. And so he has to try to figure out why it is that God has struck him.
Because if you punish someone for the manifestation of a desirable virtue, it really hurts them. It's very common for people to experience punishment for their virtue. And, you can do that with your kids too if you're jealous of them. I mean, maybe you have a kid who's really bright, he's brighter than you. It's like, are you so sure you're happy about that? And how do you know that you're not going to punish that child because you're jealous?
Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. Remember that you have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Did you not pour me out like milk, and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews. You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. Yet these things you hid in your heart. I know that this was your purpose. If I sin, you watch me, and you do not acquit me of my iniquity. If I am guilty, woe to me. If I am in the right, I cannot lift up my head, for I am filled with disgrace, and I look on my affliction. And were my head lifted up, you would hunt me like a lion, and again work your wonders against me. You renew your witness against me, and increase your vexation toward me. You bring fresh troops against me.
Maintain an even keel, and that's partly because it doesn't seem just, right? I mean, when terrible things happen to people, they always say, well, two things. How is it that being could be constituted in this manner? Like, what the hell's going on at the fundamental levels of reality that such suffering has to be the case? You'll certainly ask that if you have a child who's diagnosed with cancer, for example. Or you might think, well, why is this cruelty, as it appears, necessarily aimed at me right now in this place, when hypothetically it could have not happened at all, or perhaps been visited on someone more deserving, which is the good are punished and the evil remain unpunished, something like that. So that produces, for human beings, that produces a cry it's a cry for justice. How can the world be constituted that way? And that seems to be built into us. Those aren't questions we can just avoid. They're questions that will arise in your psyche. They'll arise as fundamental questions when sufficiently terrible things happen to you. So the existentialists would say, well, those are conditions of existence. You're just stuck with that. It's part of human nature. It's part of human being to be perplexed by those questions. Then the question is, at least in part, is there any way of answering them? What's your best strategy? Well, I can tell you as a clinician, if you take your suffering and you allow that to be transformed into a resentful bitterness, there's no limit to the amount of hell you can turn anything into. Right.
You'll deepen your suffering. Right.
You multiply it immensely.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're suffering and you still strive to find good in that, and you still maintain your faith in the essential goodness of being, then instantly that ameliorates your suffering to some degree. It puts you in the best possible position to deal with it, but it also helps you embody like this supreme metaphysical claim.
So my question here at this point is, what does that look like? What does it look like when you're striving towards the good? Or even what does it look like when you've become bitter and resentful? Because the book of Job kind of plays with this, or something like it, because the way Job laments and the things that Job says to God looks like he's sort of bitter and resentful. And then the things the friends are saying kind of look like they're aiming high. There's a famous verse that people take out of Job, and it's out of chapter 16. It's verse 19. And he says, "Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high." So there's this Job aiming high moment. But I want to read you like the handful of verses that come before this. "God gives me up to the ungodly, and he casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin, and I have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and on my eyelids is deep darkness. Although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. I wanted to read that to you so you could see the contrast in the things Job is saying. It's not really straightforward. There's a lot there, and it's a lot he's dealing with. And I think one of the important things that Job models for us is to not be afraid of saying how things truly appear to you. Because one of the things that starts to happen as Job speaks honestly to his friends, to God, is that he starts to have these revelations, and he gets these diamonds, these glimpses of stuff that's sort of beyond him. So in the case of this one, it's this witness in heaven. In another place, it's a mediator. He even has ideas about possibly life after death, resurrection, these kinds of things. And so as he's also sort of plumbing the depths of suffering, he's also seeming to come across some very valuable insights. And these aren't separable. You can't get the insights without plumbing the depths. I think that's one of the lessons of the book of Job.
And you still strive to find good in that, and you still maintain your faith in the essential goodness of being, then instantly that ameliorates your suffering to some degree. It puts you in the best possible position to deal with it, but it also helps you embody like this supreme metaphysical claim. Okay, so now let's take that one step further. So I think you see the full flowering of this in the story of Christ. And I mean this.
Okay, wait. We passed over something. Let me just rewind for a second.
You in the best possible position to deal with it, but it also helps you embody like this supreme metaphysical claim.
He said, embody this supreme metaphysical claim. And the supreme metaphysical claim he's referring to, I think, is in the essential goodness of being. Being is good. Or you could even say God is good. And that when you strive towards that, so Peterson's saying, like, when you strive towards that, you actually start to embody this. Now, this is interesting because what we just talked about was Job sort of discovering these diamonds while in his suffering, in the pit of his suffering. We talked about a mediator, talked about resurrection, life after death. These are some of the things he starts to talk about and that he sort of discovers. And he actually embodies these at the end of the book of Job. So I told you the story about how his friends have to offer the sacrifice and Job has to pray for them. Job becomes the mediator that he desired. So he starts to embody the things that he discovers. And then with resurrection, I haven't talked about this yet, but there's a passage where he talks about a tree, and you can really think of it as just a family tree, and that his family tree has been cut down. And so he says that, if a true tree has been cut down to the stump and the tree has been burned, there's hope that it could sprout again. And, he's talking about him and his family. All of his children have died. And he's saying, for a tree has hope because it could sprout again, but it's not that way for man. And he sort of has this wave of doubt after that. He's like, for man, we just go down into the darkness, into Sheol, and that's it. But even though he posed it that way, the idea still starts to take root. And we see Job sprout again. We see him having a, not a literal, but a very real resurrection from the dead.
Okay, so now let's take that one step further. So I think you see the full flowering of this in the story of Christ. And I mean this technically, because so the question is, what sacrifice is most acceptable to God? So what works best across all possible situations and places? And Christ embodies the spirit of the sacrifice of what's lesser about the self, regardless of circumstance. So, because his story is an ultimate tragedy, right? Because he has to face betrayal, tyranny, the collapse of his friendships, a humiliating death in front of his mother. Like, it is the concatenation of all the potential dimensions of suffering that is outlined to some degree in Job. And Christ's example is that you establish a firm relationship with good despite all that. You continue to aim up in love and truth despite all that. And by doing so, you simultaneously transform and transcend all that, and that's the proper model for the highest form of being. My suspicions are that pattern of voluntary self-sacrifice, which is also key to therapeutic transformation, I suspect that pattern is isomorphic with the good that lies at the center of the network of conceptions of good.
There's a lot there, and Peterson's sort of in go mode, making lots of connections and sort of pulling everything together. The connection between Job and Christ is an old one. Lots of Christians have made it.
That's an ancient connection in the tradition, to connect Job and Jesus.
William Blake, in his illustrations of scenes from the book of Job, he did all these beautiful illustrations of different parts of the book of Job. And when Job encounters God in the whirlwind, Blake illustrates this as Job encountering Christ. God appears to Job cruciform. It's a beautiful image. So Peterson has this conception of voluntary self-sacrifice as sort of being at the center of the association of all things that could be considered good. And this is something that he kind of talked about earlier when he was talking about large language models. And I'm not going to play the clip, but I'll just play the clip.
We know that some words are more similar than others. And then you might say, well, what makes words or concepts similar? And the answer would be something like substitutability, or you could think about it as, so substitutability with regard to a purpose. It's a very critical and strange definition of similarity, but also proximity in the space of meaning. And then you might say, well, what does it mean for things to be proximal in the meaning space? And it means likely to co-occur. So then you could imagine, and we're trying to map this, that you have God in the center, and then close to that would be the true, the beautiful, and the good. And then there'd be another cloud of associations around that would be second order associations. Now, the way a large language model works is that it actually learns those associations at multiple levels of comparison simultaneously. So it actually maps out what you might describe as the semantic space or the space of meaning. Now, so this would also imply, this is where it gets so cool. So imagine if we took a cloud of concepts that people universally recognized as good. So you could imagine that you and me and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins would have a fair amount of agreement on what those goods were. You know, the dignity of the individual, the idea of the good, the idea of the true, the idea of the beautiful, the idea of upward striving. Okay, now imagine that makes a conceptual cloud. There's going to be a center of that cloud that constitutes the reason for the similarity of the ideas. And it looks to me like, semantically speaking, so in terms of our verbal content, this might also be true with regards to the stories we tell, that the central concept around which all goods rotate is indistinguishable from the semantic representation of God.
This right here, I think, is the key to how to read the speech of God at the end of the book of Job. because it's not a direct answer and it's not an explanation. A lot of times we think that an explanation will satisfy us, but for our deepest questions, I don't think it does. And so just like Peterson's talking about this cloud of associations that has this center, God appears in this whirlwind, a cloud, a tornado, which is spinning and has an axis, has a center. And God's speech is characterized by an array of imagery from creation. So you have the foundations of creation, you have the sea, you have the rain, you have the lion and the ostrich, you have Behemoth and Leviathan. And all these things seem like this chaotic cloud whirlwind. But if you pay attention, it's spinning around something, spinning around a central axis. Now Peterson was just talking about Christ and how the center being voluntary self-sacrifice. And when we look at Job, like what is the center of God's speech at the end of the book of Job? And it seems to be that God is saying that everything I do is creative and generative and serves being. And so what looks like a punishment, what looks like a mistake, an error, or even cruelty, abuse, you name it, even though it looks like that, that's not what God is doing. God is doing something creative, generative, transformative, and ultimately serving everything. And we see this at the end because he becomes the mediator for him and his friends. And then after that, God gives him double what he had before. He's rewarded for his service. God refers to him as my servant Job throughout. He keeps saying, my servant Job, my servant Job. And at the end he says, my servant Job. Job is doing work for God. Then everyone in the land, everyone he knows that knew him before, and during the middle part of the book, they mocked him, they sang songs about him, they made fun of him. But now, sort of the righteousness of Job has been revealed to everyone. Just like if you can imagine someone going through a difficult time and they handle it extremely well and they come out admirable, this is what's happening. And so everyone in the land, they realize that Job is blameless and righteous. And they come to him and they're gathered in his house and they eat bread with him, it says. So you have this imagery of everyone coming into the house of Job. And I think this correlates with Christ gathering everyone up into the body of Christ or into his church. And then Job has more children. He's basically brought back to life. The tree that was cut down has now sprouted again. It's a life after death.
Can I say a quick thing about sacrifice?
Sorry, Bishop Baron, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time.